Hello, hello, hello. How is the audio, everyone? I'm hoping you can all hear me loud and clear. I could hear the intro, but you know, is there something wrong with the audio? Can someone just give me some feedback, please? Hello to everyone coming in. Happy Wednesday. I see. Well, everything should be nice and blue for you there, Mousy. Mousy is saying the audio is fine, but her color, there's something wrong with her color. All right. Thanks for the ordering coming in. Thanks. Hey, Shield. Thank you. Thanks for the orders. Oh, I could use them today. Today is one of those days where you just brush it all off and you do not let anything derail you from what it is you're setting out to do. Today, I'm going to walk the walk instead of just talking the talk. I'm going to shake it all off, say it doesn't matter, and move forward to something that I really love. And I really love doing this. I enjoy doing this immensely. In most cases, with a day like today, feeling the passion I still have for just reading legal briefs and talking to you guys about true crime, having discussions about things that, well, they're important to me, they're important to others. They don't have to be important to everybody, you know. Um, but just having a space where people can communicate, compromise with respect, that's really important to me. And so we're just going to shake it off, everything from today, and move forward and say, I'm glad you're all here. I know what I'm opening with doesn't make sense to a lot of you, and it shouldn't. I'm so glad it doesn't, that it's not affecting you in any way. Oh, today, I have to give you a little bit of a trigger warning though, because what I'm going to talk about today, if you saw the thumbnail, it is the case, as the title says, of the yogurt shop homicides in Austin, Texas, way back in 1991. And well, the reason I'm going to put a trigger warning on here for all of you is that there's nothing good about this case. Nothing. Nothing. Everything we talk about is not going to be good. From every angle, it is disappointing and let down and not the way it should be. And this shouldn't happen. And why? No rhyme or reason. So buckle up, because it's that kind of day. Um, Thank you so much, Shill, for the memberships. And to everybody that got memberships, let me just see if I can see them all. Let's see. Wow. Karen L, Toy Toys, Cinnamon, Cosmic Crazy, Case, KCA Randy, Let Them, Dan's Aquariums, and Adam and Amanda. Welcome to membership on the YouTube channel. And if you have a Discord and you want to be part of the library, I will be posting the link, membership only, tonight, that you can click. But also for those of you following on Twitch and Kick, send me a DM on Discord if you want to get in, and just tell me what name you're following me under, and I will get you in there also. Also, anyone with the Patreon, you know. Hello, everybody coming in, and thank you so much, Shill. I appreciate the memberships. I am so glad that you are here still after all this time, supporting the channel and what I do. And I hope that those of you with the new memberships will find, if you get into the Discord, it to be useful and helpful. I think it's a great place for true crime information and a little bit of fun. We talk about a lot of things in there, you know. You're not really behind, Teresa, because I haven't actually started with the case yet at all. It's going to be the yogurt homicides from 1991 in Austin, Texas. And I did do a trigger warning. It's not a pleasant story. There's not a lot that I can show you as far as a presentation. It'll be just a few things for the presentation. And yet a lot of information that has to be added to all of this. So let me make sure I have all of this up. And then we'll get to it. Sorry for the delay, guys. I just want to make sure everything's up and running. I'm shocked you managed to not kick me out in 3 years. Why would I kick you out? You actually try so hard to be helpful. And you know what? If anybody knows me, I'm just not that way. I know that everybody's human. I know we all make mistakes. I'm not perfect, and I don't expect anybody else out there to be perfect. Do I expect people to have grace and kind of, act with a little bit of decency to others? Yes, I do. I won't allow anybody to be rude to each other in my chat. But I do want you all to have your own opinions. I do want everyone to feel comfortable, you know. But, enough of all of that. Let me actually get on with what this is about. Okay, so brace yourselves, everybody. This is not a pleasant story. We're going back to 1991, and we're going to go to Austin, Texas. And we're going to a place, I can't believe it's yogurt, a shop that some of us may be familiar with. It's a franchise and a chain. And back in 1991, on December 6th of 1991, 4 young women lost their lives. They were friends. 2 of them were workers in the store that were there closing up. It was the evening after everybody went. This was an unaliving that was brutal and horrifying to the area, to everyone that involved. This was traumatic, to say the least. The reason that I'm talking about that this was the most complex and haunting of criminal investigations. It spanned 34 years. I didn't misspeak. I actually just said 34 years before reaching the actual resolution this September of 2025. These teenage girls were horrifically, brutally unalived inside the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. Like I said, on December 6th of 1991, it led to decades-long investigation marked by false confessions, wrongful convictions, and ultimately a breakthrough through advanced DNA technology that identified the actual perpetrator. The case will be documented now and officially solved with no further trial proceedings, since the identified suspect, which I'll name later, actually unalived himself in 1991. However, in 1999, however, this whole case represents a comprehensive closure for the victims, families, and exoneration of 4 men. Yes, you heard right. 4 men wrongfully accused of this crime. This whole story gets horrific. But first, let me introduce you to the victims. They are, as pictured, Amy Ayers, who was only 13 years old, who was just a friend visiting the shop after closing. Eliza Thompson, who was 17, who actually worked there and was closing. Jennifer Harbison, the other co-employee who was working there, and her sister, Sarah Harbison, who was 15 at the time. They are way, way too young. Way too young. Okay. Now, they all knew each other through a 4-H type thing, the young, the Future Farmers of America Club, where they raised cattle, they rode horses, they did farming. They knew each other all well. They were very popular in the community. They were well known, well liked, wouldn't hurt a fly. Jennifer only lived a block away from the yogurt shop. Um, it was a neighborhood that people cared for each other. It was a time in 1991 where you did have people at their age drinking and partying. And of note, behind this yogurt shop, there was a bit of a patch of a creek and some woods where teenagers and young adults would go and party and, do underage drinking and hang out and whatnot. And that'll become important later when we talk about it. But I don't want to act like this was like some pristine town where nothing ever happens, because it wasn't. It was your average town suburb in 1991. You had problematic teenagers, you had the good kids, the bad kids, you had your normal kind of stuff, and you had your normal crimes too. But nothing compared to the level of horror that happened here at this yogurt store. Yeah. Okay, so we've met the victims and we will talk of them often. To say that this is horrific, I mean, the trigger warning is well needed here for this case. Just the age of the victims and what had happened is right. The girls were found. A call to a fire that broke out at the yogurt shop is what led them to discovering of the bodies. The perpetrator, after doing what he did, actually lit the whole place on fire to get rid of evidence. And that is one of the problems with the case, because the fire department, before even discovering the bodies, had to start extinguishing things. So everything is soaked in water and everything is destroyed by fire. When they finally get inside, they find the girls were bound with their own clothing, gagged, shot execution style in their heads, and the 3 of them were essayed. The perpetrator then set that building on fire, like I said, to destroy the evidence very cleverly. And that worked for a long time. The perpetrator has been discovered as of September 26th of 2025 through extensive research of a cold case detective, who I'll talk more about later, who finally put in the DNAs through and the ballistics through, and it was identified to be a serial killer who had already had a history. He's linked to at least 8 murders from 1990 to 1998 across Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas. His name is Robert Eugene Brashers. Okay. But for years, nobody knew this. 34 years, nobody knew this. 34 years, this case went on and people were persecuted over it. And that's another horrible part of this story. And one that I thought needed to be brought to light because it's still going on. Y'all know I do like to focus on the new technologies and how they get into the court systems. And yesterday when I was doing my live and we were talking about other cases, we were talking about new innovations in new technology in DNA and ballistics that were actually coming forward and how it actually changes cases. And this is one that it actually affected dramatically. The ability to test small fragments of leftover DNA. A cold case detective to decide to take the last piece of viable DNA that he had available that wasn't tested yet, to put it in with the new technology to test it, and actually get a 1 in 2.8 million match to this perpetrator, without a doubt, who was also caught with the caliber gun in 1991, just 2 blocks away from the restaurant, the yogurt shop, with the actual gun, which they took the bullet that was found in a drain that was left over and hadn't been destroyed in testing yet, tested it to an exact match to Robert Eugene Brasher's gun that was on his presence when he was arrested. Of course, he wasn't arrested for this particular crime. It was for a traffic violation or border crossing or something like that. He died January 19th of 1999, a standoff against police in Missouri, and he took his own life. His criminal history, like I said, includes 8 other murders from that time period across 4 different states. He was arrested 2 days after the homicides of these 4 young women at a border checkpoint with a stolen car and the .380 pistol that matched the murder weapon precisely in the bullets exactly in 2025 when they were tested. The physical evidence, like I said, that finally put this case to a close were taken from Amy Ayer's fingernail clippings, and they contained the actual DNA of the perpetrator because this 13-year-old was the one who viciously fought back. Her body was discovered away from the others, as if she was escaping or fighting. The other 3 were piled on top of each other in a haphazard type of way. The DNA analysis that was used was the YSTR DNA analysis, the 2.5 million to 1 likelihood match to Robert Eugene Brasher's. And YSTR DNA analysis is the analysis of only the male chromosome. Well, they only looked at male suspects. They narrowed the pool down from the rest of the world to make it more precise on who they were looking for. Biological evidence was also taken from DNA that was found on victims Jennifer and Amy, matching a single unknown male, although it was so degraded it could not, because of the fire in the water, that it could not be type matched exactly to him. But it was a single unknown male. The ballistics evidence used, like I said, was the .380 caliber shell casing that was found in a floor drain at the crime scene, away from the fire. It was linked through NIBIN database to a gun owned by Brasher's many, many years later. 2 weapons were used in this assault, a .22 caliber and a .380 caliber firearms, and 5 total shots were used. Brasher's carried that .380 pistol, the same make and model as the murder weapon, when he was arrested 2 days later. However, the .22 caliber becomes important in the rest of the story. Right? A lot of the evidence was compromised. Fire damage and water from the sprinklers and firefighting severely compromised the entire crime scene. Unidentified fingerprints found in the cash drawer, they never matched any suspect. And that's important. I want you to remember that. The DNA previously tested did not match any suspect, nor did any of the fingerprints that they found match any suspect. Well, now we get to the horrible part. As if the loss of these young lives was not enough, the story gets worse. Because in the 34 years that before this case was finally put to rest, 4 men were wrongfully accused. From 1999 to 2009, 4 young men at the time, 16 and 17 years old, had their lives ruined with wrongful conviction and blame. It wasn't until this DNA testing that completely exonerated them. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that although they are exonerated, their lives are already ruined. They have no recourse. You would think the system would be bowing to them and giving them whatever they need. But the story gets even worse from here. Like I said, buckle up. There's no happy ending here. There isn't even anything that I, with my love of law and order and reading of legal brief and respect for all of the process, can find not one iota of justice anywhere in this case, except for the brave and tenacity of a detective that's assigned to cold cases who wouldn't let it go and took a chance to try to do it right. But even that doesn't bring justice because what they do with it afterwards is nothing. But I digress. Let me go forward. So the four men that you see here are Maurice Pierce, who was 16. These are pictures at the time that they were uh, going through the legal process. Forrest Welburn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. I'm sorry, I have those two pictures reversed. Springsteen's on the end, and Michael Scott is the third from the last. Maurice Pierce was arrested quite quickly after the event on December 14th. The event happened on December 6th, the discovering of the bodies. He was arrested with a gun, the same make and model as the murder weapon, which was a .22. He gave false confession under interrogation by Detective Hector Palanco. Now, Detective Hector Palanco, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him, but I will tell you this. He had multiple charges against him and rumors against him about pressuring suspects in investigations to get confessions. He had a very high solve rate in homicide. And well, around the time that these interrogations happened and when everything started to come to light, he was transferred out of the police department in Austin where he was conducting these interviews. He was not even the investigators assigned to the case. That was two other detectives. But he stuck his nose in and he did some of these interrogations. And I have to tell you that there's a documentary out right now on Hulu or HBO, okay? And it is called The Yogurt Shop Murders. It's on HBO, Hulu, YouTube. Let's see. You can get it on Prime Video, Roku, okay? Just about anywhere. Currently, it's a four episode docu-series, but it actually came out before they did the final testing, before the final results came through, so it doesn't have the conclusion here. But the reason I'm pointing you to it is that I've got I want you to hear some of the interrogations because then maybe you'll know why I'm feeling so strong about this. It is quite evident when you listen to it that the techniques that were used to get coercion of anything here were brutal. These were very long interrogations. They used a technique that is still used to this day from a book that I'll go into later on techniques, and that he did not heed any of the warnings in the book about how you would get a false confession if you did X, Y, and Z, because he did X, Y, and Z like 10 times over, in my opinion. And yes, this episode is full of opinion. This is what the AF legal, because I'm scratching my head and dumbfounded at the bullshit that went on in regards to this case. They had two detectives on it that did what they could. The evidence was bashed. They were very close with the family. One of them was close with the family. The other one was just trying to keep his distance and be a little hard ass about everything and, trying to look at everything. They interviewed everybody. As a matter of fact, when this first person, Maurice Pierce, actually did his confession, they read it. They knew that parts of it couldn't possibly be true based on the investigation that they had done and based on things that this other detective, Hector Palanco, did not have privy to. He didn't have privy to what kind of cash was in the register, the placements of anything like that. And so this young man is going through an interrogation and turned the other three in because, yes, they had a gun. These were not good guys. They were kind of at the age where they were bad guys, but not that bad. They were petty thefts. It was Texas. They had a gun. That wasn't necessarily a crime because everybody in Texas had a gun, but they didn't have it registered. They shouldn't have had it. They were too young. They were drinking. They were too young. They hung out and caused trouble, catcalled and, threatened other guys, or like bad, but not bad, Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, they were not murderers. Okay. Yeah, well, not everyone. You're right, Grace. Not everyone in Texas has a gun, but you have to admit that them having a gun was not that out of the realm of possibilities in 1991. Okay, we're not talking now. It wasn't even that most young men did. Okay, yeah, rough but not exactly. Couch. That's a good way to put it. Rough, but not exactly killers. Not that Of course, law enforcement's going to look at them like they're not the best, the best guys on the planet. And they could do something wrong, but not to this extent. Okay, so it starts with Maurice Pierce giving a forced, coerced confession, naming the other three and the events that happened, that was not collaborated enough through any of the actual physical evidence or what the other detectives knew of the case. So they kind of didn't go forward with it. And it would have been okay. Okay. It would have been okay then, except for, well, Forrest Welburn, the second young man, he got arrested, but he never confessed to anything. Okay. All right. Um, all of these arrests happened back in the arrests that follow the confession, that Maurice Pierce made in 1991 with Detective Hector Polanco. 8 years go by before the men mentioned in that particular confession or even brought in to be questioned. And you might be shaking your head like I was, like, why? Why did that take so long if that confession was any good? That's because the lead detectives on the case read through it and knew it was bubkus. They knew the reputation of Hector Polanco. They didn't trust him. So they took their own they did their own interview with Maurice Pierce, and they found that his details did not match the case, the things that he was saying. Plus, he actually gave different interview. He did a completely different scenarios. Okay. So he was arrested and he was charged. He never really got up to any, he was, had weapon charges and stuff like that, but everything was dropped in 2003 for lack of evidence. But because of this actual confession, his life was full of harassment after that. And unfortunately, he did die in 2010 in an altercation with police. He felt harassed, he felt persecuted everywhere he went, which is a story the three of them will also mimic throughout, that the whole town was against them. They were blamed for the murder, even though they weren't convicted, even though he wasn't charged with the murders. He was harassed unbelievably. Everybody just considered him as guilty, including the prosecution in the police department, who would pull them over, harass them. I mean, they weren't great guys anyway. And I understand that. Like when he actually passed away in this altercation, it was because he was wrestling with the cops and he ended up slicing one of their throats before he ran away, realizing what he did, knew his life was over, and decided to take it himself. Like I said, the story is horrible. I'd be surprised if YouTube even lets me get in the algorithm with this one. But these are the facts. This is what happened. And every part of it is horrible. The second person arrested and charged in 1999 because the two original detectives, after 8 years of dealing with the family and dealing with everything, one of them being very close to the family and trying to get answers, but unwilling to arrest anybody based on a false confession from Maurice Pierce. A lot of pressure politically, a lot of pressure from the prosecution department because, man, that woman who was leading that, she wasn't letting anything go. They wanted answers for the family. They wanted to solve it. The other detective involved was getting a lot of complaints against him because, like, he was just one of those hard ass kind of guys. He came off as being very insensitive. When you watch, you'll see what I mean if you watch the documentary. He doesn't come off as very empathetic, and you could see why people were butting heads with him. Anyway, the one that was close, Mr. Davis, that was close, Detective Davis, that was close to the families and everything, they decided he was too close. He had PTSD from You can imagine the seeing of these bodies and dealing with this case, what that did to everybody involved, firefighters, the police department, everybody that's dealing with it. Not to mention the horribleness that the families are going through, just the horrendousness of the event itself, the loss of those 4 young lives, the way that they were lost, how they were treated, what happened to them. Horrific. It affected everybody. The 2 original detectives are no longer on the case, and they bring a new guy on. And the new guy finds the original confession that Hector Polanco got. And he decided that this case is not going to be ruining his so-called reputation and his stats, so to speak. And he pulls the 4 of them in. They get arrested on the charges. He makes up, pulls them in for conversations. They do the same technique that Hector Polanco did, and they get false confessions out of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen after 20 hours of videotaped interrogation. Okay? No physical evidence against either of them. They even said, in the case of Robert Springsteen, he held out pretty long. And he actually kept saying, it's impossible. I was at the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I go there every weekend, and that's what I do. And they actually lied right to his face after like 15, 16 hours of this interrogation and said, would you be surprised if I told you it wasn't showing that night? Now, this is 8 years later. His mind flips. He now realizes all he wants to do is get out of this room. They think he did it. So he confesses just to get out of the room, to get a lawyer. To hear their stories was heartbreaking. I want justice for the girls and their families, absolutely. But what happened to these 4 men was wrong. So wrong. Forrest Welburn got arrested in 1999, but no matter what they did, he would not confess. The jury, without a confession, wouldn't move forward because there's no physical evidence tying him to the crime. That everything was dropped for lack of evidence, and he was fully exonerated. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were not so lucky because they bowed under the pressure of intimidation, manipulation, and I'm using very strong words here, but if you heard these interrogations, I think you would agree, because I can't give them a grain of doubt. I know the detectives are doing their jobs, but the way that they did their jobs, they overstepped. Every technique that they are using has a boundary, and they decided to go past that boundary. All the warning signs are there. I'm not an expert in criminology. I don't have a degree. They do. Most of them, they study it. They've got the handbook. X, Y, and Z are there as the warning signs of when to stop because you're going to get a false confession. And I can see them in black and white coming right at me, and they keep going because they just wanted to solve the case. It is, they're not even apologizing for it now. Michael Scott was subject to 20 hours of videotaped interrogation. And he went to trial. They got the grand jury indictment. He went to trial. They went to trial with nothing but the confession. No physical evidence against Michael Scott, except for what Maurice Pierce said about them owning a 22. Okay? And that they had it that day, and he's not sure where they went. Using this information back and forth. They used his confession against him and also the confession of Robert Springsteen. They used the confessions against each other, which ultimately ended up in their guilty verdicts. Michael Scott was sentenced to life without parole, and Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death, but then it was reduced to life the year before for the homicides. For the same case, they used each other's confessions against the other, which ultimately ended up in the convictions for both of them being overturned in 2006 on constitutional grounds. And actually, that became a landmark case for constitutional grounds about the admissions of confessions against co-conspirators and co-defendants and how and when you can use them. Okay. It also developed a lot of the tests of forced, coerced testimony that could go forward, or confession, so to speak. Because in the case of Robert Springsteen, as soon as he left, he recanted. He recanted his confession immediately. He confessed to get out. Michael Scott, I'm not sure if he recanted it or not. But anyway, they didn't even get released until 2009 when the charges were finally dismissed. Both of them are currently seeking compensation. But when I tell you this is a horror story of legal justice, it's a horror story of legal justice. We'll see. Yep. Okay. I'm just checking to see if you guys had questions. Um, let me pull this down because most of this is just talking right now because some of the facts of the case. Okay, I told you that Eugene Bowers, Robert Eugene Brashers is the serial killer who actually is actually named, and the case will be closed. That he is the actual perpetrator in no further investigation. But you may be wondering, well, now that they released Springsteen and Scott, like they should get some compensation, right? They should be, you know, apologized to something. You think they were back in 2007 when everything got overturned, but no, it was dismissed without prejudice, so they could be refiled. So they sat there. They sat there in jail waiting for the refiling of the charges by a district attorney who just wanted the win and didn't want to be considered wrong, because that's a great win when you're settling this case, and the last thing they wanted to do is tell the family they had the wrong guys. And to this day, that prosecution team and that leg of justice right there, the police and everybody, none of them stepped forward to actually apologize in any shape, form, or form. Even in the documentary, they're still insisting that they had something to do with it. They don't want to be told right. It's the new DA now in September of 2025 who looked at the evidence and said, case closed against them. They case dismissed. But they're not even able to get compensation since 2009, because in Texas, it's so convoluted how they have to go there. They served years. They served almost 10 years of their life stripped away when someone else did the crime. They had the charges overturned. They had the convictions overturned, and they were released in 2009 with nothing. With nothing. It's a horrible story. That's what I keep saying. I know I keep repeating myself. They absolutely horrible, horrible story. Let me tell you about the process in Texas that has to happen for the wrongly convicted, you know. So after they are released, well, first those violations leading to the overturned convictions. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned both the convictions for Scott and Peterson in 2006 and 2007, respectively, ruling that the prosecutors have violated the defendant's Sixth Amendment rights by using their co-defendant confessions against them without allowing cross-examination. That's where the violation happened. In other words, because Scott and Peterson would not Scott and Springsteen would not testify against each other. They weren't facing their accuser at the time. They weren't testifying, put on the stand. There was no cross-examination in regards to the confessions. And that's a Sixth Amendment right. If you're going to bring in anything that a co-defendant says, the other one has to be able to cross-examine them on it. But if they choose not to testify, then they can't. And that precedent has been established, and it is an important protection against the use of coerced confessions in joint trials. And it has gone forward to change things in many other states. Okay. Um, this was in Travis County District Court. Okay, there were quite a few judges involved, and I'm not going to get into all of the people that were involved. But the current legal officials in Travis County is Jose Garza, who has publicly apologized to the wrongfully prosecuted men. Um, in Lisa Davis is the Austin police chief that actually announced the 2025 breakthrough. And it's Detective Daniel Jackson who gets the great shout out for being the cold case detective who finally solved the case, who didn't let it rest. After there were wrongful convictions, he knew that the murderer was still out there. He knew there had to be a physical tie and that they did have evidence. Evidence, by the way, physical evidence that was never presented in the trials of either Springsteen or Scott. I'm serious when I say the only thing they had was the confession. That's what they had. And some circumstantial information that Maurice Pierce said that they were at a certain location at a certain time and that other people may or may not have seen them. Remember I told you about the little area in the back where the teenagers all hung and the guys and everything like that? They knew that a group of them hang out there. Maurice Pierce actually mentioned it in his first interrogation. And yet the detectives that are actually trying to prosecute and pin everything on Springsteen and Scott never talked to any of those kids that were back there. You'll hear about that in the documentary. I was floored. The documentary brings a lot to light about what happened. It also brings a lot about how the victims' families suffered, how the community suffered. One story of one of the young women's sister tells the other side of the story when you are a sibling who survives a tragedy like this. And it kind of broke my heart because she puts it succinctly when she says, you don't just lose your sibling, you lose your parents. Because the parents are suffering of the loss of a child and they're never the same. And that young girl's life was never the same. That young girl suffered for years and years thinking, not feeling abandoned, feeling left, trying to hold her sister's memory alive because those parents were so broken, they never mentioned the sister's name again. And this young girl who was younger than her sister had to deal with all of that. She became actually an advocate for victims and a therapist at the end. And she has a decent life now. Well, she suffered. She suffered so through all of this. Like the amount of suffering in this case is probably some of the worst I've seen. Not only 34 years of not having the right killers in an unsolved case, not having closure, but to have 4 other men wrongfully accused and everybody involved in their lives all blown up and destroyed. Their marriages, their parents, their siblings, their relations. How did, being put in there and then actually pointed at that you had anything to do with it. How do you get a job? Robert Springsteen actually had to move out of the town before anything happened. And probably a good thing based on what happened to Maurice Pierce. The harassment that they report is a lot. Now in the documentary, you'll see that Robert Springsteen, I keep seeing Patterson, I don't know why. Robert Springsteen has an effect that's very flat and he's very matter of fact about things. It makes him look as if he doesn't care. But I ask you to look twice because I don't think that's the case. I think he gets a lot put on him because of it, and it just could be his personality. He's very stoic. He's not a soulless person. He's got a wife and a family and people who love and care about him. And he's trying to do the right thing, but I think that they deserve compensation. But there's going to have to be some hoops that go through because they've been very unsuccessful up to date. Okay. And let me just tell you why. Because I think that's one of the other horrible parts of the stories, I mean, the shining thing is knowing that there are detectives in cold case like Daniel Jackson. I mean, if there's any bright spot, there's the healing process that the sister went through. And there's the shining spot of Daniel Jackson being the kind of detective that takes his work seriously and goes the extra mile and just makes sure that he's doing everything that he can to close something, finally, to find some justice. Although I don't know if this is justice, because although we know who the perpetrator is, they will never be brought to trial. They will never be accused of this claim, this, formally charged and accused and indicted and face the system. So, let me get to the long process of this. Let's talk about the interrogation techniques for the technique that is used. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the Reed technique. It's a book that guided these interrogations. It's called In Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, and it's a controversial manual. And I am sad to tell you that it's still used a lot. It was written by Freddie Inbow and John Reed and Joseph Buckley and Brian Jane. And the manual is currently in its 5th edition, put out in 2013. And it does remain the standard textbook for police interrogation training across the United States. And like I said, it's still widely used. The Reed technique continues to be taught and practiced in police departments nationwide, despite mounting evidence of its role in producing false confessions. The 5th edition includes updated material on distinguishing true from false confessions to try to counteract some of that. But the core methodology remains largely unchanged since the 1940s when it was put out. It has a 9-step process. Okay. Step 1, positive confrontation. Tell the suspect definitively that evidence proves their guilt. Step 2, theme development. Offer moral justification or minimization for committing the crime. I understand how you felt. Now, I might have done the same if I was in your shoes. Oh, anybody would react that way. Those kind of things, right? Step 3, handling denials. Cut off all attempts by the suspect to deny involvement. Step 4, overcoming objections. Turn the suspect's objections into admissions of guilt. I wasn't there. Well, I wouldn't admit I was there if I was you either. See what I mean? Step 5, procurement of attention. Ensure the suspect is listening and engaged. The whacking on the desk, the moving around, the lights, the questions, the raising of the voice, all of these things to just startle and get them and make sure that they're paying attention. Don't let them settle down. Don't let them get comfortable. Handling of the mood. Show understanding when the suspect becomes withdrawn. Alternative question. Step 7. Offer a choice between 2 versions of how the crime occurred. Not that it didn't occur or you didn't have anything to do with it, but did you do this or did you do this? Did you approach from behind or the side? Did you grab her with your left hand or your right? Step 8, oral confession. Obtain a verbal admission of guilt. Step 9, get the written confession. Convert that oral statement into a written document before they leave. Now, Hector Polenko was the problem officer in this case from the start. He was a very problematic interrogator. His track record included patterns of false confessions. He had a documented history of obtaining them, including the John Salazar case, where he extracted a confession from a suspect who was actually in police custody at the time of the crime. And he knows it. Do you see what I mean? The shake my head, scratch my head, I can't believe this happened. Yes. His role in the 1991 event for the yogurt shop homicides, he was the one who interrogated Maurice Pierce, as I said, for hours. And because Pierce was arrested with a gun that matched, the 22, that matched some specifications, but it wasn't the 22. Pierce confessed to the murders under Polenko's questioning. But Detective John Jones, from the original that was assigned to the case because Palenko was not, quickly realized the confession didn't match the crime scene details. Palenko was removed from the yogurt shop task force in February of 1992 due to concerns about his interrogation methods and his pattern of eliciting false confessions and interfering with the proper course of the investigation. Palenko was later fired for perjury, but subsequently reinstated, and he retired in 2001. He became the subject of federal civil rights lawsuits filed by suspects he had interrogated. And that is a long process and probably still going. Because once his techniques were put out there and once the police department actually acted on it, he became ripe for turning a lot of this over. Now, the 1999 interrogation team included them using the Reed technique, was led by Detective Ron Laura and Detective John Hardesty. They are not the original investigators. That was Mr. Jones and Mr. Hucken. I think it was Huckenham or Huckenby. His first name Mike. There was also another person on the interrogation team starting in '99, 9 years later, like 8 years later, was Robert Merrill. Okay. Now, he committed the most shocking act captured on video during Scott's interrogation. He brought a loaded revolver into the interrogation room and jabbed Michael Scott in the head with it in what appeared to be the gun barrel while conducting role-playing exercises to get his attention. I kid you not. It's caught on film. It's part of the interrogation documentation. This is how far they went. John Hardesty is a co-interrogator with Laura, and he employed the classic pressure tactics, telling Michael Scott, you need to say something really bad, buddy, because the next phase is coming really quick and your opportunities are diminishing. Like, you need to admit to something bad here or it's going to get worse for you. I kid you not. I heard it myself. Laura was the primary interrogator for Michael Scott, and he repeatedly told Scott that his friends, Robert Springsteen and Maurice Pierce, had already blamed him for the murders. Laura later recanted this testimony, admitting he had lied during the interrogation repeatedly. They lied to him, and don't get me wrong, I know the police are allowed to lie, but how far does it go? How far does it go? These are young men, okay? Michael Scott's 20-hour ordeal. 20 hours with that. Multiple days in a 7x10 room at the police department. What they did was make an assumption of guilt. They blocked all his denials. They actually had him told him repeatedly that his co-defendants had already implicated him. And they suggested that his role may not have been as serious as his friends if he would just say exactly what he did. These were constitutional violations left and right. They repeatedly ignored his lawyer request. They refused to let him call his wife. He felt that he couldn't leave. He wasn't arrested, yet he wasn't allowed to leave. And then the gun incident. How the hell does that happen legally in an interrogation? A loaded weapon in an interrogation room used against someone who's not under arrest yet, okay? And described as startling by court observers when they saw it. Robert Springsteen was arrested in West Virginia, not Texas, and they actually went during his extradition to do his actual interrogation. And funny how it was 5 hours long, but there's only 3 hours on film. The backup tape mysteriously ran out during critical portions, like different parts, not the beginning, not the end. It just kind of ran out, like here and there. Kind of sus, right? The quality of his confession contains the same factual errors as Scott's. In other words, the confessions that they gave didn't have the placements of the body, didn't even have any placements on how the crime was committed, the money that was in the drawers, none of the physical evidence that was available, even though damaged by water and fire, the things that they could actually put in the police file as the documentation of the crime scene and how the crime more than likely occurred, were not collaborated in either Scott's or Springsteen's confession. How the hell do you take that to court? Somebody explain that to me. Both Springsteen and Scott, and here's where I can reiterate that Scott actually did recant. They both recanted their confessions almost immediately, and they both refused to testify against each other at trial because they felt they were railroaded, and rightly so. Anyway, in August, this documentary, The Yogurt Shop Murders from HBO, it brought renewed attention to this whole case. It's how I discovered everything going on. And right before the big explosion of it actually being dismissed because they found the real perpetrator. It actually, I'm glad they make this documentary because it brings to light these awful interrogation techniques that are used. And you know me, I'm pro law and order, but there's a line. There's a line, you know? And it's everything was violated. I mean, we all know that they're allowed to deceive, but they went too far. They really went too far. It's actually just to close the case, and knowing they have the wrong guy. How, in all good conscience, did they feel they had the right guy? If none of the physical evidence matches, if nothing is collaborated, how do they actually go forward thinking they have the right guy? It highlighted a lot about how this technique, the Reed technique, exploited their youth and their psychological vulnerabilities. You know, what some of them wanted, like Maurice Pierce felt so betrayed by the police afterwards because when he went into that interrogation room, he actually trusted the police. He actually thought, and when you hear his interrogation, they had him believing he just didn't remember doing it. And he started to say things like, how could I have done this and not remember? Those are words coming out of his mouth, and the police are going with it and using it against him. You can hear his confusion. You can hear his mind snap, for Christ's sake. You literally hear him snap to where he just falls in and just starts thinking he's wrong and they're right. He was questioning his own memory. He was questioning the fact that he could have done this. He kept saying, I would never do anything like this. And they were like, yes, but you did. And it was relentless. So besides the fact that it's still using, there is definitely a lot of opposition to this technique that started like back then. There are alternative approaches like the peace method that is used in a lot of places. That's planning and preparation, engage and explain, account for clarification and challenge of anything they say, closure and evaluation. Those method was developed in Britain in the 1990s following high-profile false confessions. Like Britain did a lot to actually eliminate those and actually did something. And some of this method is still being used over here, but not enough. The key difference is the philosophy. Peace actually focuses on gathering information rather than seeking confession. It turns the interrogation process into a fact-finding mission where you can collaborate and actually prove that they were there and go with the case file and actually match things up so that if your actual interrogation suspect does confess, it's solid. You know, you've got something to go on that matches collaborative. You could believe it. It uses open-ended questions instead of accusations. It prohibits deception and false evidence presentation. You're not allowed to lie to them. It builds records before questioning begins. And it allows the suspects to give uninterrupted accounts of what happened. In other words, not to get interrupted to change things as they go, which was happening in this interrogation. They were being led to say the right words. Like if he said knife, they would say, "You mean gun?" I kid you not. Oh, yeah, gun. You know, the studies demonstrate that peace produces equal confession rates, but significantly fewer false confessions compared to read-based methods. And so I would say, why not use that? Okay. Now it's used all over the United Kingdom. In Canada, you guys used it a lot. They adopted it in 2015. New Zealand has used it forever. Norway, almost it's the standard there. It's used peppered throughout other institutions, but it's not the standard here in the United States. The Reed method is still the standard. Okay. Despite its proven effectiveness, the United States is still unwilling to make it the standard. Its use is extremely limited. Okay. This case has had a lot of impact constitutionally throughout the legal system. It made systematic changes in 2009, increased court scrutiny. Judges are now more likely to exclude confession evidence obtained throughout questionable methods. They ask more questions. Recording requirements of all interrogations. They are mandated in most police departments now when the whole time you're in there. Expert testimony. Courts are increasingly allowing psychological experts to challenge coerced confessions to testify about how false confessions are acquired, the risks of them, and the coercive interrogation techniques that may have been used. They're allowed to challenge that interview. They are allowed to challenge that documented confession now from both sides. The defense can go very, very hard and actually challenge it even being admitted. If there's no collaborating testimony, if that's all you have, it could get tossed. And I doubt in 2025 this case would have went to trial if it was anywhere else, because those statements would have been challenged by the defenses, and a judge looking at both sides would have pulled them if there was any doubt, especially since there was no collaborating evidence for anything that was in the confessions. The only thing, most states, police departments have the mandated recordings. However, I do have to disappointedly tell you that there is no federal mandate for for recording interrogations, or an alternate technique to training besides the read. Juries and the public still maintain a strong bias toward confession evidence, regardless of how it was obtained. It actually can be a clincher when somebody says they did it. It's like it gives them permission to just slam the door. And more often than not, that's what they do. Now, both Springsteen and Scott did try to sue to get their wrongful conviction, some kind of monetary compensation, some kind of recourse. The exoneration and compensation aren't automatic, unfortunately. Each faces distinct legal challenges in achieving full vindication and financial redress, so to speak. Robert Springsteen's current status is that he's represented by former Texas Court of Criminal Appeals Judge Charlie Baird, who, along with attorneys Amber Farrelly and James Hackney and Broadus Spivey, have been fighting for formal recognition of his innocence since his charges were dismissed in 2009, because they never declared him innocent and wrongly accused. They only said that they dismissed the charges. The prosecution never came forward and did the other part that would allow him to go forward for compensation. Springsteen has applied twice for state compensation and been denied both times by Texas Controller Susan Combs, who and later her successors. And those denials stem from Texas' stringent requirement that applicants prove actual innocence rather than merely having their charges dismissed. There has to be a declaration from the prosecution that that they were wrong, which prosecution was refusing to do. That's not the new prosecutor. He's not doing that. Now, in 2013, Springsteen filed a federal lawsuit seeking declaration of actual innocence, arguing he was entitled to over $700,000, which by the computation of what he would be allowed is actually pretty well spot on, for his 9 years of wrongful imprisonment, 4 of them which were on death row, horrible conditions. Okay. The federal court dismissed the case, ruling it lacked jurisdiction to make innocence determinations outside the habeas corpus proceedings. They needed to file habeas corpus, and in order to do that, there had to be an active trial, and he had to be declared innocent, and he's not. The legal catch-22 exists. Springsteen faces an impossible situation. He can't file a habeas corpus because he's no longer incarcerated. But Texas law requires a habeas corpus finding of actual innocence for compensation eligibility. How is he supposed to get it? Now, that's where he's at. But now this prosecutor, I said, has come forward and declared that they have the right guy. This guy is now being listed as the perpetrator. Okay, Brasher is the guilty party. They're closing the case and declaring that if he does take it farther, which I'll go through the steps in a little bit after we talk about Scott, where he's at, we'll see. But you're going to see this is unsurmountable and how there's just no justice in this case for anyone, actually. Michael Scott was seeking full exoneration also. Scott is represented by Tony Diaz of the Diaz firm. He specializes in criminal defense and civil rights cases. Following Brasher's identification, Scott had actually come out and said that this stole decades of his life, but the truth has finally surfaced. The public didn't see the horrific torment that I went through all these years, and my family are victims too. Now, Scott served 7 years, and he would be entitled to about $560,000 just on that. Because the average current Texas compensation rate's $80,000 a year for wrongful incarceration, which I think they're entitled to. They were wrongfully convicted. The original suspect died in 2010, Maurice Pierce, and his family cannot pursue compensation because it was an altercation with the police, the event that cost his life. And he was the first to be wrongfully accused and persecuted. And Forrest Welburn, he was the only suspect who never confessed. And he was no billed by a grand jury and had the charges dropped to the lack of evidence. And his current compensation status remains unclear. Or what he did about it and everything. He was wrongfully accused and he did suffer his reputation, and he was persecuted throughout the town, and people just still thought he was associated with it. After all, it was his 2 friends that were going to jail for it, and his other friend who said he did it. So he did face it. The Texas provides some of the most generous compensation in the nation, if you can get it, if you can jump through the hoops, They give $80,000 a year. That went up in 2009. It used to be only $50,000. If you get actually paroled out, they give you another $25,000 a year that you're on parole. They give you an education benefit of 120 credit hours. They give you health care for a certain amount of time. They give you support services for yourself and your family and reintegration into the society. and they give compensation for payments and interest that accrued during imprisonment. If you had to pay child support and were unable to do that, they actually take care of a lot of that for you. But the impossible high bar is the actual innocence declaration. That critical obstacle that's facing Springsteen and Scott is Texas' requirement to prove actual innocence. They would need one of three specific pathways. They need a full pardon based on innocence from the governor, or the habeas corpus relief with a court finding of actual innocence, or a habeas corpus relief plus dismissal, where the district attorney states no credible evidence exists and believes the defendant is actually innocent. The dismissal of charges in 2009, while vindicating them, doesn't meet those statutory requirements because prosecutors cited insufficient evidence rather than affirming and declaring the men innocent. They actually held open that should evidence come forward, they would prosecute them again. Now, the strongest path forward is that Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza issued a formal statement of actual innocence. Garza has already publicly apologized, stating the evidence points to the guilt of one man and emphasized the innocence of those previously convicted, but has not made that formal statement that they need. Okay. With Brasher's identification providing definitive proof of the real perpetrator, both the men can resubmit their compensation applications with stronger evidence of their innocence. But if the system isn't behind them for it, it's going to be tough. This case highlights a lot of the flaws in Texas compensation law that created an impossible procedural barrier for legitimately innocent people to collect on a system that they're so proud of. The reform efforts could eliminate the statute of limitations and broaden the innocence determination pathways, but it's hesitant that will happen because it's going to cost so much money. Both men do have potential for federal civil rights claims under 42 U.S.C. From 1983 against the city of Austin and all the individual officers that perpetrated against them. Coercive interrogation techniques violating due process, false imprisonment and malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence and perjury, denial of right to counsel during interrogation, which happened on tape. Yes, I kid you not. Brady violations, withholding exculpatory evidence, especially about Palenko, who was really under surveillance already for false confessions. And none of that was reported to the jury or to the defense when they went forward to trial. Detective Hecker Palenko, ironically, won a $290,000 federal civil lawsuit against Austin in 1996 for discrimination, establishing that the city can be held liable for officer misconduct. Yeah, he won. He, the perpetrator of all of these false confessions, he won. Okay. All right. There is a 2-year statute of limitations for civil rights claims, though. So that's going to be a problem. This case is 34 years old. They were released in 2009 when the charges were dismissed. This is 2025. It's a broad hill that they got to climb. I mean, the wrongfully confused, the wrongfully convicted, rather, the personal impact that they go through, the psychological trauma, lost opportunities, the continued suspicion that they still had after 2009, public perception, the legal complexity of the system. It was a nightmare. This whole case is a learning lesson for the system itself on how to improve, because no one won here. The families, after 34 years, they know who did it. But there's no justice, no trial. They know that other men that they thought did it and they thought it was done were released. Some of them still thought they were guilty, thought the system failed them. The system failed everyone in this case. No matter who part of the story you read here, you just want them to be whole again and be able to move forward. Well, there doesn't seem to be a path for that at all. You know, it doesn't look like the governor is going to do a pardon to get in those justifications. He doesn't really have, you know, the governor there is Greg Abbott, and he doesn't have a strong history of doing pardons. He doesn't really, you know, he doesn't really court that very much, you know. He's got a troubling record on wrongful conviction cases. He just doesn't abide. He doesn't want to hear it. There are several cases before him now, and he's not doing anything. A purely political mover at this point, but I don't know enough about it to really go into it. The most likelihood for them to go forward is if the district attorney will um, actually make that highest likelihood of success would be if the Travis County District Attorney, Mr. Garza, would actually turn his statement into an actual proclamation of innocence legally on the case. And then they could possibly go forward. But they still would have to fight, especially on the civil end. Like I say, you know, just saying they're innocent at this point doesn't seem like enough. Just saying we found the actual killers just doesn't seem like enough. You know? So how was the killer arrested 2 days later with the same gun and not questioned is beyond me. Exactly, because although he had that type of gun, they weren't communicating. It was like a couple of the officers. There was a lack of communication going on for sure. It was definitely a mess up because he had a point 380, and maybe within those 2 days they weren't sure about the caliber. They only had bullets. Remember the crime scene, waterlogged, fire burnt. They didn't know everything yet. So he was arrested 2 days later. They didn't have the information on what weapons were actually used. Okay. So that's how that started to happen. And nobody went back through the police records to find it. You feel like you want to write a letter to Garza for them? Yes. I mean, so many are. Yeah. I feel sad and angry. Me too. Me too. Michael Scott later went on to become a manager at paper company. Sorry, I just keep thinking, oh, get out of here. He did not. I wish he did. I wish there was a happier part about it, you know, for that. I must say that you promised that everything would be terrible and you delivered. Hey, I don't tell stories. Like, I was honest about it. It was horrible. And, well, the only shining spots are the cold detective. You know, he's great. That is good. The healing that happened with the sister was a bright spot in the story for me. And also, I mean, just the fact that DNA testing and ballistics actually solved this case 34 years later, that we now have the ability to do that. Okay. That if they would just put it through the system, if somebody just took the time to close it like this detective did, definitive answers can be found. You know, and I guess that is what I want to end with, because I really should end this now. I am sorry that it was such a horrible story, but that's a sorry not sorry, because these things need to be discussed. These things, the only way to improve systems and to prevent these things from happening again is the outrage that we all feel. that it happened in the first place. It's horrible enough, the loss of the lives. I feel for their families. I feel for the women that never grew up to have the lives that they deserved. Okay. But that was one man who did that. But they ruined so many other lives over it. And it actually brought to light a lot of other things that need to be addressed so more lives aren't ruined. You know, we want the system to be fair for everyone. And it's a fine balance, and sometimes it works really great. But when it goes bad like this, it goes really, really bad. This was, from the start, a horrible case. I feel for the original detectives who had to work this case. It's not the kind of case, it's the kind of case you never let go of, the kind of case that haunts you for the rest of your life. Seeing those bodies, knowing that there's no evidence to act like being up against the wall, seeing the families all the time, dealing with it constantly and not having anywhere to go with it, chasing down leads and suspects and talking with people and getting nowhere. It had to eat them alive. And I get that. But for the other ones to just pick up that ball and say, well, that's not going to happen to me, false confession time, let's just, hammer them to the wall. It was political and nauseating. It is. It all starts with the original perpetrator, who was just a horrible human being. Absolutely horrible human being. But on that, I'm going to leave you guys with that. I can't say that the next one will be cheery, but at least on the weekend, we have other things to talk about. So everybody have a good night. Don't forget to like and share, and please comment. I do like to hear from y'all. And, well, like I said, this one will probably just stay there with no views on it. I don't know if anybody will get through this whole video, But thanks for you who listened. I really appreciate it. I don't know. I really don't know that I want to do more like this. I mean, my original intention was that it was because of the DNA and the ballistics that brought it forward. But the more that I checked into it in regards to the false confessions and the techniques that were used and how far law enforcement went, and then reading what the prosecution did on top of that, that really shocked me, because prosecutors are supposed to balance the evidence against the crime. And yeah, they want a conviction and everything. But to know that those confessions didn't support any of the physical evidence, and they didn't even come with the backing of the original detectives on the case. Once they dismissed those detectives from the case, nobody ever asked them a question about the original investigation at all. The prosecution didn't care at all. Um, there was just so much. When you see the documentary, if you do watch it, which I do recommend, I don't often recommend these documentaries because they're a lot of hype, but there's so much additional information in there about all the other people that were persecuted in the hunting and the solving of this crime. They went after people who dressed in dark clothing, the people in black, they called them. Yes, the people that dressed in black, the goths. They went across this one woman because she was all witchy, and everybody looked at her like she had a cult and thought maybe she had something to do with it. It was some kind of ritual sacrifice. It's so many of the townspeople were calling in and complaining about her that she must have had something to do with it, that she literally received death threats and skulls in the mail, and her life was ruined. You know, there's so many more people that I didn't mention that come up in the documentary. Not to mention just the families, the siblings, the parents, everybody who went to school with them, everybody in the Future Farmers Association that dealt with the girls, everyone in the men's family who dealt with the persecution. Oh, you know so and so. Oh, you're his relative. Oh, you know them. Oh, they're the ones that did that murder, right? Even after they were exonerated. Well, we know they really did it. Prosecution wouldn't have went for them if they didn't, right? Yeah, they were. It's just horrible. Why is everyone else getting skulls mailed to them except for me? It's so unfair. Well, put your address out there and request them, Couch, and see what happens. Who knows? You might get lucky. I'm just not so sure that you want to be lucky about that. You know, it did ruin so many lives, Mousy. You're right. It's just, you're right. They are hard, but they do need to be talked about. And I do appreciate you all. And those of you listening, later, I really appreciate that you come and you listen. I had to have a little rant about it. I'm still horrified by what happened in this case. Not just the original event. It's so mindless and so unfair. And then everything that happened afterwards just really shook my faith a little bit in the justice system. And the only thing that's saving it is the fact that that was then. Like, that was 1999. I can hope that in 2025 it's a little bit better. But after reading the statistics on the read technique and how it's still used and they refuse to move forward with better techniques, I'd have to say my outlook is a little tarnished now. And I'm going to be looking at things a little bit different. Oh, it was a sad case all around. I do check out. I do also. Oh, I forgot one thing. I had an article here. Where they discuss the actual perpetrator, the one who is actually guilty of this crime. For those of you that would like to check it out, here it is. And like I said, the name of the docuseries is The Yogurt Shop Murders, and it starts on HBO, but it's available on Hulu, YouTube Primetime subscription, Sling, the Roku channel, Amazon Prime, and HBO Max. And for those of you that are clever, I'm sure that you can find a free link to it somewhere. Because like these days that exists everywhere. Although I don't expect you to break the law. I'm not telling you to break the law. On that, okay, now I'm really going to end it. So I hope you all have a good night. Looks like a few people just came flying in to watch this after I've been live for a while. Almost to hit the algorithm. I must have said the right word. Well, either way, y'all have a good night. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. Again, thank you. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate all of you that give me your comments, that come and talk to me about this stuff. And let's just, try to take the few bright spots away with this one and just hope that it will be a case study on how to do things better. Like, it will be the one that's used on how let's not do this anymore, right? Let's just make things a little bit better. All right. So thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.